Let us pray. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Now, just out of curiosity, with a show of hands, how many of you have ever watched Mr.Rogers' Neighborhood? That's pretty much all of you. Now, of course, when I was a child, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood was a very popular TV show. It was different, though, wasn't it? I mean, I really liked to watch cartoons when I was a kid. I watched Scooby-Doo, I watched Tom and Jerry, I watched Bugs Bunny and the Roadrunner. But when you watched Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, you knew that there was something just different about it. And I bet most of you can probably remember the opening of the show, too. How he walked in through the door, sat down, took off his work shoes, put on his cardigan and his sneakers, ready to start the show. Of course, over time, I felt like I got too old to watch Mr. Rogers. I didn't think about it all that much. He was just that guy wearing a sweater with a kids' TV show. But as I followed my second career into ministry, my calling into ministry, Mr. Rogers started creeping back into my life, time after time. You see, there's something about the story of Mr. Rogers and Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood that taught me what it meant to be a good neighbor. And so it seems like a perfect tie-in for our gospel message for today. This message we all identify as the Good Samaritan is one where Jesus is asked by a man of the law who is trying to trick him, what do I have to do to inherit eternal life? Well, Jesus tells him that he must love God with all his soul, with all his strength, with all his mind, and he must love his neighbor as himself. And then, of course, is the classic question, one that we still struggle with even 2,000 years later. Who is my neighbor? And in typical Jesus fashion, he doesn't give a straight answer to the question. He tells a story. And he tells this story of a man who's traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho, who's robbed and beaten and left for dead on the road. And there the man is, lying there. And along comes a priest. He sees the man, but he doesn't stop. Instead, he veers to the other side of the road. And then there's the Levite, another religious leader who comes along, and he crosses over to the other side of the road as well. Two religious leaders, two kinsmen, perhaps, of the injured. And they decided to avoid the man in the road. But then there's that third man. Ooh, those Samaritans. And as that Samaritan walks by, he stops. Now, you have to understand that Samaritans were considered as lowly individuals. Even by the beaten man's standard, he wouldn't normally have spoken to the Samaritan. He thought of himself above him. But Scripture tells us that the Samaritan sees the beaten man and he is moved with pity. He bandages his wounds, he takes him to an inn, he tends to his healing needs and then pays for it all with his own money. He even tells the innkeeper, provide for him as he needs, and I will be back and pay for it all. So Jesus finishes the story and then he asks that lawyer, so who was this beaten man's neighbor? And of course, the reply is the one that showed him mercy, the Samaritan. And Jesus says, go and do likewise. It is one of the most important stories in our entire faith. That's why even people in the secular world are known as good Samaritans when they help somebody that they have no relationship with. But yet we still sometimes ask ourselves, what does all of this have to do with Mr. Rogers? Now, I would suspect that many of you are aware that Mr. Rogers was also an ordained Presbyterian minister. However, his calling to ministry took a different path than those of his seminary classmates. While many of his classmates were called to serve in parish ministry like this, Reverend Rogers was called to and ordained into a new ministry arena, children's television. Mr. Rogers believed that television presented a new opportunity. He didn't really care for some of the content that was on TV at the time, and he saw the potential for something better. And he wanted to teach children things like the value of respecting others, of being kind, of introducing themselves to people they weren't familiar with, of facing their fears, and yes, how to be a good neighbor. And so every show started with that song that we all know. The one where he crosses that line, not usually crossed by adults, and spoke to children in a way where it was clear that although he was an adult, an authority figure, he still respected children. And he asked those children right there on TV, "Won't you be my neighbor?" Now, as a minister of the gospel, he knew what that meant. He knew that we who are calling ourselves Christians are called to be neighbors to the most unlikely of people, even the people on the other side of the television screen. And though he never overtly preached on his television show, every episode seemed to be infused with a gospel message. Now, at this point, it may be easy to say, well, yes, it's easy to love your neighbors in a place where everyone walks through unlocked doors and wears comfortable sneakers and cardigans. It's not hard to pick out, our favorite neighbors from the neighborhood of make-believe. But what about the real world? The one where you and I live. The one where not all of our neighbors are what we expect. The ones who are different. You see, I think he got that too. After all, he was hosting a children's show, and so he was speaking to kids using situations they understood. But if you read a little more about Mr. Rogers' life, this was a man who always seemed to cross the lines to make new neighbors. When he wasn't on camera, he often stood up for others. For example, there was an episode where he had a police officer, an African-American police officer, come onto his property, and Mr. Rogers is sitting there with his feet in a wading pool. He then invited the officer to share that wading pool. It was not a message that was common to see in the late 1960s. Yet, there they were, sitting in the wading pool with their feet side by side. And you know what he asked the police officer? He asked him to share what he knows about love. And the police officer broke into a song. You see, that's Mr. Rogers, breaking boundaries. But the reality that we deal with sometimes is that we don't live in this neighborhood of make-believe. Or do we? Like I said, Mr. Rogers continually broke those lines. The work and ministry of Fred Rogers was one full of breaking boundaries. As a pastor, I've often thought to myself, what would Mr. Rogers do in this situation? So allow me to share another story. This one may surprise you a bit. Mr. Rogers, when approached by reporters, was considered to be a tough interview. However, the reason for that label has nothing to do with Mr. Rogers treating reporters poorly, like so many entertainers and public figures do today. Mr. Rogers was known as one of the toughest interviews because he often befriended reporters, asking them tons of questions, taking pictures of them, and even compiling an album for them at the end of their time together. He even followed up by calling them afterwards to check in on them and hear about their families. See, he wasn't really concerned with himself. He genuinely loved hearing the life stories of others. And amazingly, it wasn't just with reporters. Once on a fancy trip up to a PBS executive's house, he heard the limo driver was going to have to wait outside for 2 hours. So he insisted that the driver come in and join he and the executive, which of course flustered the host. And on the way back, Mr. Rogers didn't sit in the back. He sat up front with the driver. And as the driver informed him that they were passing his home on the way back to taking Mr. Rogers back to his apartment, Mr. Rogers insisted on the driver stopping. He got out, went into the driver's home, met the driver's family, who instantly lit up at the idea of Mr. Rogers being in their household. Then he sat there playing jazz piano with them, talking with them late into the night. And just like with the reporters, Mr. Rogers sent the driver notes, kept in touch with him all throughout his life. It's a great story, isn't it? It's one of my favorites to share. As a matter of fact, there's an article that you can find online, 15 Reasons Why Mr. Rogers Was the Best Neighbor. I encourage you to read that. But Mr. Rogers wasn't the only one that showed how to be a good neighbor. I have one last story I want to share. I'm a sports junkie. And since it is baseball season, I thought perhaps I'd talk about a baseball legend, about another individual that has been inspiring to me. Number 42, Jackie Robinson, the first African-American to play Major League Baseball. Now, many of us know the part of the story where he played for the Brooklyn Dodgers, he broke the color barrier, and was a superior performer on the field. But it wasn't until I started ministry that I heard what came to happen to Mr. Robinson after he retired. See, Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier on the field, but he was still faced with barriers in his everyday life. He had to break the barrier of where he faced trying to buy a house. After he retired, he and his wife tried to buy a house, and he faced resistance. Now, we may instantly want to think, well, where did he buy his house? Was it somewhere in the deep south where we associate with all of, the tensions and struggles of that time? No, he was buying a house in Connecticut, and his neighbors weren't happy. The story goes that when Jackie Robinson moved there, his neighbors were so angry that they were sharing the neighborhood with a black man that they even ostracized the man who sold them the property to begin with. You might think that a man who had been a ball player, a national hero, an icon for millions of Americans might be welcomed. But no, what Mr. Robinson found was that his neighbors were as hostile as those early baseball crowds had been. But one neighbor wasn't. The Congregational Church, which later became the UCC Church, that was just down the street from his house. They welcomed him and his family. And because they welcomed him, not only did the Robinsons have a place to worship, but the church had a chance to show who they were. They were a neighbor to the Robinsons. Now, we shouldn't expect anything less from a church now, should we? I mean, being a neighbor to all is part of the calling of being the church. It was an act of sharing and receiving grace. So what does this story have to say to us today, to those of us who are gathered in the 21st century in Oley? I know that a number of you attended a joint worship service with Christ Lutheran last week as you ponder the opportunity to share ministry together. I know that you've been working together in different ministry facets with education and Bible study to try to discover a path where perhaps you may come together in a shared ministry. My thought is if we are serious about this whole following Jesus thing, we have to love with the same open-hearted abandon as the Samaritan. We have to exhibit the same kind of neighborly attitudes as that UCC church did to the Robinsons. We have to love with the same willingness to embrace the newcomer as Mr. Rogers did. We have to dare to cross that line in the road. We have to build unexpected relationships that will save not just one of us, but both of us. So let's never make the mistake of thinking that the ones who cross the lines don't receive grace, because they do. But most of all, we have to ask the question that Mr. Rogers asked so many times. Not just to the people we want to ask of it, but to everyone. Won't you be my neighbor? No cardigan, no sneakers, and even poor singing is not required. Just a sincere conviction in our hearts. Because we are challenged to really ponder over a tough question. The question that sits before you all. Instead of just being a neighbor down the street, what about being a neighbor in the pews? Won't you be my neighbor? They are hard words to say sometimes. But when it comes to being the church, really being the church, to being Christians, to being Jesus followers, Jesus challenges us just like he challenged that lawyer. Who was the neighbor? Who desired to make the community grow? Who's caring for someone while expecting nothing in return? Who chose life over death? Who chose relationship over money? The Samaritan. The Good Samaritan. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? Won't you be